Good morning, everyone. I hope you're well as we go into this fourth day of our lockdown. And we are busy doing the 21-day Bible reading program going through the New Testament. So in the first 3 days, we read through the Gospel of Matthew, and now we move on to the Gospel of Mark. But before we go on to Mark, just a bit of background on the four Gospels. We have the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each one of the Gospels places a certain emphasis on Jesus. It has a specific purpose that it wants to highlight throughout the Gospels. The Gospel of Matthew shows Jesus as the King of Israel, the Lion from the tribe of Judah. Mark shows Jesus as the servant, the suffering servant. Luke shows Jesus as the man, and the Gospel of John shows Jesus' divinity. The first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are known as the Synoptic Gospels, which means that they are seen together. That means that they draw from each other. The Gospel of Mark, which was written first, and then Luke and Matthew draw information from Mark and also from other sources. There's a big overlap in the material that they use, so it's thought that they would use Mark as a reference, and then Luke and Matthew would add in onto the stories of Mark. So the Gospel of Mark, we don't know exactly who wrote it, but church tradition has that it was written by John Mark. John Mark was the companion of Peter. So as Peter went around preaching the gospel and teaching, that Mark would accompany him. Mark would then write down some of the teachings that Peter gave and compile it into the Gospel of Mark. It's estimated that the Gospel was compiled or written down at between 50 and 70 AD. That's about 20 to 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. But most scholars believe that it's closer to the 50s and 60s, this would then enable the other gospel writers to draw from the material of Mark. It's thought that it was written in the region of Italy, and more specifically in Rome, that Mark was with Peter at the time in Rome just before his martyrdom. A lot of the early church fathers allude to this. Irenaeus and Clement of Alexander say that they were in Rome at that time. The Gospel of Mark was written to Gentile believers, most probably to the church in Rome. We know this because Mark has to explain some of the Jewish traditions, and also some of the Aramaic words that he used are translated so that they can be understood by Gentile Christians. An outline of the book of Mark is that John the Baptist starts to preach. He baptizes Jesus. There's a short account of the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness. And then we have the early ministry of Jesus around Galilee, where he preaches and teaches. Then we go into the expanded ministry, where Jesus continues to preach, continues to heal, and he starts to encounter opposition to his ministry. The central section, we have Jesus on his way to Jerusalem. In the final ministry, Jesus confronts the authorities in Jerusalem, and there is some apocalyptic discourse. And then finally we have the Passion narrative, the Last Supper, the arrest of Jesus, the trial, the crucifixion, the death, and the burial. In chapter 16 we have the conclusion, where Jesus' tomb is found to be empty. The last section of Mark, which is Mark 16 verses 9 to 20, was most probably not in the original version of the Gospel, but could be a later addition. It does not appear in the earliest manuscripts that we have, but that doesn't make it any less authoritative, and it does not contradict anything that is said elsewhere in the Gospels and in the Bible. So there's some unique material that's found only in the Gospel of Mark. There's this introductory verse in chapter 1, verse 1. There's the story of Jesus' family who tries to restrain him in chapter 3. In chapter 4, there's the parable of the seed growing of itself. In chapter 7, Jesus heals a deaf man in the Decapolis. In chapter 8, Jesus gives sight to a blind man in Bethsaida. In chapter 14, a young man runs away naked after Jesus' arrest. There is some speculation that this young man might have actually been Mark himself. And then you have the concluding passages from chapter 16, verses 14 to 18, where there's the commissioning of the 11. The Gospel of Mark is a simple, to the point, and unadorned, yet a vivid account of Jesus' ministry, emphasizing more of what Jesus did than what he said. Mark moves quickly from one episode in Jesus' life and ministry to the next. The book is characterized by the beginning of the Gospel, which is chapter 1, verse 1. As you read through the Gospel of Mark, notice how Mark emphasizes Jesus' deeds rather than his teachings. Jesus is the servant who came to set those in captivity free, and the one who comes to save us from our sins. Even though you might have read the Gospel of Mark before, I pray that when you read through it this time, that you will see something new and something different.